Hello, and thank you for viewing our 2020 ACA Reporting video. We've continued to simplify our data gathering spreadsheets, making it much easier for you to enter the information and for us to ensure you have a timely and accurate filing. The first thing you'll need to complete is our employer data gathering spreadsheet. If we've prepared your filing before, you'll already have an IRS EIN verification document. Go ahead and put your name in column 8B as it is on that document. If you don't have one yet, just put your company name in 8B and we'll work with you afterwards to get one of those IRS EIN verification documents and make sure the name that we have matches that. Similarly, you're going to go ahead and put the EIN in box 9 there. Between 10 up to line about 15 is just going to be the company's address and phone number. 16, 17, and 18 are going to be the name, title, and email of the individual who's going to be signing the 1094-C. It's generally going to be an owner, a president, an HR manager, or other C-suite executive. Once we get to line 19, this is where you're going to identify the lowest cost plan available to your employees as of January 1st, 2020. For the first example here, Company 1, Diversified Administration has a calendar year plan that goes from January 1st to December 31st of 2020. Line 22 is where you'll actually select the waiting period for benefit eligible individuals. In this example, our waiting period is 60 days, and the coverage effective date is set to code 2. This means the individual becomes eligible first of the month following the 60 days. If the individual became covered on the 61st day, we'd leave the waiting period 60, but change this coverage effective date to code 1. When a benefit eligible employee terminates, they do remain covered until the end of the month in this example. The other option would be if their benefits end on the date of termination. Line 25 is where you indicate whether or not the plan essentially is ACA compliant. Does it provide minimum value? Typically, your answer there is just going to be yes. Line 26 is asking for the dollar amount of the employee's required monthly contribution. So they're going to be looking at essentially the bronze tier, regardless of what plan the employee actually took, what was the least expensive plan available to them, and what tier. Now we're only talking about the employee only tier, not employee plus spouse or plus family. And then with that employee only bronze tier, what's the employee's portion they have to pay? Well, in this example, Diversified pays 100% of the contribution, so the employee's portion is 0. Based on that, the affordability safe harbor we're going to use is federal poverty level. We'll look at some of the other options in just a minute. The funding arrangement for this particular benefit is fully insured. If you are unsure as to whether or not your plan is fully insured or self-funded, you would want to speak with your insurance broker. They will be able to tell you what kind of plan you have. For lines 29 and 30, you will typically be putting yes here, and this is just to indicate that if an employee is on your plan, they have the offer to enroll their spouse or dependents in coverage. Now, for companies that have multiple divisions, EINs, or anything like that, you would go ahead and put the additional companies further to the right. So for this example, we have Diversified has a second EIN, Diversified Filings Incorporated. So we've got their information, their tax ID, address, and everything here. This particular company, though, does not have a calendar year plan. They have a non-calendar year plan. The plan that was in effect January 1st of 2020 is actually the plan they had starting July 1st, 2019. So they're essentially looking at the second half of this plan, essentially what happened from January 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2020. There's the same waiting period, the first of the month following 60 days, and benefits ending at the end of the month. It's an Obamacare compliant plan providing minimum value. Now here, you'll see it's not quite as generous a plan. Here, the employees have a employee required monthly contribution of $101.80. Based on that, the affordability safe harbor is actually rate of pay, and this is going to be your threshold. So anything that is below 101.80, you're going to use federal poverty level, and anything that's this amount or higher, you'll use rate of pay. We do have a third option, W-2. That's used very sparingly and in very specific circumstances. So if that's the case, we will work with you on that, but it's typically going to be federal poverty level if it's 101.79 or less, and rate of pay if it's 101.80 or more. Again, in this example, it's going to be a fully insured plan offering to both spouses and dependents. You'll notice here, though, we have additional information in lines 31 through 42. This is about the plan that begins July 1st, 2020, and goes through June 30th of 2021. So this gives us the information for that second half of the 2020 calendar year. So we just have the rest of the information for the plan. It's identical to the plan they had here, although it may not always be. If the plan changed, you would enter that information here. But that's basically all you would need to complete the employer data gathering sheet. If you have additional companies, they just go over to the right. And if you have a short plan year or something that causes there to be more than 2 plans in a single calendar year, we do have 2 additional spaces here for other plan information. Now, once you've completed the employer data gathering spreadsheet, you're going to need to complete the employee data gathering spreadsheet. Now, what we've done here is given a bunch of examples of the most common situations. We'll take a look at what those look like, how to enter those, and then we'll also cover a few less common situations. Between what we cover here should absolutely take care of almost all of the data entry that needs to happen. But should you have a situation that's not covered here, please reach out, and either myself or one of my team will be more than happy to answer any of your questions. So in this form, we're going to begin by putting the name up here in the employer field, as well as the contact information, name, phone number, and email. One of the things we like to do to ensure that we're able to process this easily is get a second contact. Sometimes people get promoted, they move, termination, whatever it happens to be. Sometimes our original contact is no longer available, and having a second contact really helps to ensure a smooth process. So once you have your contact information up here, we're going to go ahead and just take a look at what some of the fields we're asking are, and then we'll look at the situations. So this notes column is actually an optional column. You don't really need to put anything there. I've used it in this example to explain each of the different situations or scenarios that's happening here. However, if you wanted to let us know anything, that note column is where you can do it. Next is your basic demographics. It's the employee's social, first, last name, their address, city, state, and zip. Our country code, if the individuals are living in the U.S., just go ahead and leave it blank. If they have a different country that they're living in, you would just go ahead and put that there. I'm going to go ahead and hide some fields just to give us a little bit of space here. I'll go ahead and freeze these. So once we're past the demographic information, let's take a look at some of the other information we're asking for. So the first thing we're asking for is the hire date of any employee who was working during 2020. So if they were hired before 2020 or sometime during 2020, you would just go ahead and put that date here. Next, we're asking for their employment status, either on January 1st, 2020 or on their date of hire. And it's typically going to be either full-time or part-time. We'll look at NA shortly. Next is we're looking at the affordability. Either the coverage was affordable, it was not affordable, there was no coverage offered, or the individual was a COBRA or retiree. Most typically your answer is going to be yes, and every once in a while there will be someone who wasn't offered, but we'll look at those situations shortly. Once the coverage, we're looking at it, it was offered, this is did they take the coverage? And the individual is either insured, waived, possibly they're in a union plan, maybe they weren't offered benefits even though they were eligible, or possibly they were not even benefit eligible. We'll look a little more closely at these also shortly. Column P is where we put our initial insurance coverage offer date. This is when they were first offered coverage in 2020. If they started the year either insured or waived, we would just leave that January 1st, 2020 there. You will see some different dates in some of the other fields. We'll go ahead and look at why those might be different as we get to those examples. Further down, we have two columns here dealing with status change. If you have a status change either going from insured to waived or waived to insured, you would go ahead and put that here, either whether that was an individual doing it themselves or if it was a mid-year open enrollment and you have a number of employees making changes there. That's where that would go. One of the last common fields you'll be using here are the termination date and date coverage offer ended fields. Termination date is pretty self-explanatory. That's the date the employee terminated. And the date the coverage offer ended. This could be one of two dates. It's either going to be equal to the date of termination, or it will be the final day of the month that the employee got terminated, and that will be determined by the employer sheet that we just looked at. In the example I was using, we used the final day of the month. So that's why you'll see here that employees terminated May 2nd were still covered until May 31st. We do have a few more columns to the right. If an individual either went from full-time to part-time, part-time to full-time, or was terminated and rehired, they would be entered in columns U and V. Now, when these employees are rehired, they have this new employment status, they may have been eligible for coverages to be offered, so those would need to be completed as well. Every once in a while, you have the situations where employees go through a new number of changes, so we do just have this going to the right, a few more iterations of that. Most likely you won't need to use almost any of them, but usually the first one or two. After that, usually it becomes exceedingly rare to use those. So now that we've taken a look at what the basic columns that we're asking for in the employee data gathering spreadsheet, I'd like to take a moment to look at basically your most common situations here. The most common situation is going to be identical to Bruce Wayne here. We see he's worked for the company for quite some time. He started the year as a full-time employee. The coverage offered was affordable. He took it, and he was insured all year. End of story. That's all we need for him. Bruce Wayne insured all year. He's covered. No problem. That's how you enter it. Similarly, you may have people like Don Draper. He's been there, again, quite some time. Started the year as a full-time employee. The coverage offered to him was affordable, but he waived it. He waived the coverage starting at the beginning of the year, and nothing ever changed. Just throughout the end of the year, he remains waived. This will only apply to a few companies. If you do not have employees who get their insurance coverage through a union, you would not be using this option. If you do have employees getting their benefit from a union, here's how you would enter it. We'd look at employees like Betty Cooper. Again, she's been there for a while, started as a full-time employee, was offered affordable coverage, but it was through the union. She took it at the beginning of the year, and nothing changed. So those are going to be pretty typical situations of someone just remaining insured or waived all year long. So let's take a look here at Archie Andrews. He was a full-time employee, and he was insured until he got terminated. So again, as we can see, he's been there quite some time as a full-time employee, offered affordable coverage, which he took since the beginning of the year. However, on May 2nd, he was terminated, but his benefits, because of what we have in the employer sheet, we know extend until the end of the month, so his benefits ended 5/31. And that's how you would enter an employee who had coverage and then terminated. Wade Wilson's information will be very similar. He was also a full-time employee who got terminated, but his coverage was waived. And as it's familiar now, we'll see he's worked there for a while as a full-time employee, offered affordable coverage, which he waived from the beginning of the year. He was terminated in June 10th, and even though he didn't take the coverage, the offer still extends until the final day of the month based on the employer sheet. So termination date of 6/10, date the coverage offer ended, 6/30. Now, these are also incredibly common situations you're likely to have. Logan Howlett, he's a full-time new hire who became insured throughout the year. So he was hired on May 20th. Based on the employer sheet, our benefits begin first of the month following 60 days of full-time employment. So based on that, Logan would actually become eligible not on January 1st as everybody else. He wasn't hired yet. He would become eligible on 8/1, which is first of the month following 60 days here. Clark Kent is going to be a very similar situation. He is a new hire, and he's waived through the end of the year. So he was hired 5th of July, and first of the month following 60 days, his offer was on 10/1, which he waived. So that's how you would enter a new hire who waived coverage. Now, these next two examples are a little trickier. So these are individuals who were hired right towards the end of last year. Geraldine Grundy was hired towards the end of December, and Stephen Rogers was hired in the middle of November. Based on our waiting periods, first of the month following 60 days, Geraldine Grundy did not even become benefit eligible until March 1st, and similar, Stephen Rogers didn't become benefit eligible until February 1st. So we'll always want to make sure that even for these new hires that were hired towards the end of last year, that we do have the appropriate coverage offer date here. Now, these next two examples are going to get less common, and they're only going to get less common from here. So those are your most typical situations. Here are some of the other situations that aren't as common but aren't as rare either. Peter Parker was a full-time new hire. He began the year insured, but then after he waived, possibly he got married, went on his spouse's coverage or something like that. So we'll see Peter Parker has worked there for quite some time as a full-time employee, offered affordable coverage, which he took. Took it since the beginning of the year, but as of 5/1, his coverage offer status is waived. So as of 5/1, he no longer has coverage; it's waived. And the exact opposite is what happened here with Jughead Jones, a full-time employee who had waived coverage since the beginning of the year, but on August 1st, he had a status change and became covered. So if you have employees who switch mid-year, either from insured to waived or waived to insured, this is how you would enter their data. Now we're going to take a look at some of the ways that a company would indicate that no coverage was offered. And I wanted to start that off with this one here, which as you can see bright red is indicating this will get you a penalty. If there was a full-time employee who you just decided to not offer coverage to. So Tony Stark, he's been there for a while as a full-time employee. We didn't offer him coverage. Why not? Just because we just did not offer it. So if you have not offered, that's going to generate a penalty. But we had to have that option there because sometimes that's what companies did. If you indicate that, we will double check with you because we're going to want to make sure we don't submit anything on your behalf that's unnecessarily going to generate a penalty. So hopefully you do not enter anything that says not offered, not offered. But if you do, we will certainly indicate to make sure that that's what actually happened. Now, this is one of the other situations where you can have someone who was not offered coverage. We had a full-time new hire who termed before they became eligible. So Charles Xavier was hired February 1st. And we see he's a full-time employee, but he was not offered benefits. Why not? Well, because he was not eligible. And that's because he terminated March 15th. That was a month and a half after he was hired. So he did not make it that first of the month following 60 days to be offered benefits. That's also why you'll see that this is blank. Because he was never offered benefits, there's never a date that that offer expires. So if you have an individual who you hired and terminated before their waiting period, this is how that would be entered. I'd like to go over one last example of a permissible way to not offer coverage here. Now you'll see that Robert Banner, even though he's been here for a few years, he's a part-time employee. And just at our particular company here, Diversified, part-timers are not benefit eligible. Um, Even though he started the year part-time, we see here that he became a full-time employee on March 22nd. Now, with that being the case, he's now a full-time benefit eligible employee first of the month following 60 days of full-time employment. Well, that's on 6/1. So we offered him coverage on 6/1, which he took. If he waived, obviously that would just be waived. So let's take a look at a few of these last, again, uncommon examples that all companies are going to need to concern themselves with. So if you have a full-time individual who had waived coverage and transfers to part-time, this is how it's going to look. It's going to look like how we have Veronica Lodge here. She's worked for us for a while as a full-time employee. We offered her affordable coverage, which she waived, and that actually should be 2020. So she waived her coverage since the beginning of the year. But then we'll see on 5/22, she became a part-time employee. Now, as we said, part-time employees are not benefit eligible. So she was not offered coverage because she's not eligible. So that is the case with a full-time individual. When they waive coverage, there is no, excuse me, and they go to part-time, there is no coverage for them to continue taking, which is a little bit different than the next example, which I'd like to cover here. It's a little different, and that's why I kind of wanted both of them. So Charlie Brown was a full-timer who, just like Veronica, went from full-time to part-time, but because Charlie Brown was insured, it's a little different. So he's worked for us for a while as a full-time employee, insured since the beginning of the year. Now, he became a part-timer in the middle of April. However, you'll notice here it says COBRA. This is the only time that we're going to be asking for COBRA information for a fully insured company. That's when you have a full-time individual who was insured, and then because of a reduction in hours, was offered COBRA. So at that instance, he would no longer actually be eligible for the insurance on the company because he's not benefit eligible, but he did lose his coverage, so he is eligible for COBRA. And we would just indicate that he began here immediately at the end of his when he was a full timer. One of the last situations I'd like to cover here is a rehired employee. So here we've got Garfield Arbuckle, and he has been with the company since 2011. He's a full timer who is insured. Again, this is supposed to be 2020. Apologize. So we now have Garfield full time insured from the beginning of the year, but he terminates in March. Terminates March 15th, and his benefits terminate March 31st. However, June 25th, and this would actually be rehired, we have rehired Garfield as a full-time employee on 6/25. He again was offered coverage and took it. It became effective on 9/1, which is first of the month following 60 days of his new employment status as a rehired full-time employee. For fully insured companies, that is almost all of the situations that you would need to enter for your employees. If you have a situation not covered there, definitely reach out to myself or a team member, and we will make sure that whatever the situation is, we get it entered in such a way that that is addressed. Before I talk about the last two entries there, the COBRA participant and the retiree participant, those are specific to self-insured companies. but I would like to draw everybody's attention to this new States tab because even fully insured companies are going to need to concern themselves with this. So on this States tab, just like the other tab, we have a Notes tab. We also have the Employees Social Security tab. Now, these fields, the first, middle, and last name, automatically update when you enter the Social Security. Now, each different state that's listed here has very specific but different reporting requirements. And rather than go through a bunch of different hoops and asking whether or not you meet each of the requirements, we actually were able to distill it and just say, hey, did an employee live in this state at any point during the year? And if they did, you would just go ahead and put an X in whichever state they lived. And we'll make sure for individuals that are in New Jersey that their filings are addressed. Same thing for California, Rhode Island, DC, and Vermont. As more and more states add individual filing requirements, we're likely to ask for that information as well. But for the 2020 filings, these are the states who have filing requirements. So whether you are fully insured or self-funded, if you have any employees who have resided in any of those 4 states or Washington, D.C., please be sure to put their Social Security number here and indicate with an X which states they lived in. If you are a self-funded employer, or offer a self-funded plan, I should say, there are a small number of other things you would need to be concerned with. Since you're also the insurance company technically and not just the employer, you would need to report for individuals who are on your plan but are not employed. So this could be a COBRA participant, someone who was on your plan, they worked for you, had coverage, and then terminated and are continuing that coverage through COBRA. So here's how we would enter that. So Lois Lane, now she is not an employee. She is neither a full-time nor a part-time employee on January 1st of 2020. She's not applicable. She's not an employee, either full-time or part-time. Her status here is COBRA. And for COBRA, they will always be insured because if they have waived COBRA, they are not receiving benefits and don't need to be reported. So if you have COBRA here, necessarily this is going to be insured. And if they began the year on COBRA, it would just be 1/1/20. If the person remained on COBRA throughout the end of the year, that's all you would do. If the person ended COBRA, we would do something like we did here for Michael Scott. COBRA and retiree participants are entered very similarly. Neither one of them is an employee. They both get NA. While Lois Lane got COBRA, Michael Scott is a retiree. And they both started the year, similarly on January 1st. And just like COBRA, this must be insured. Similarly for retiree, this necessarily will be insured. If they're retired and not getting benefits, they would not be included here. Now, the one thing that we did want to indicate is for this particular individual, their retirement benefits ended 7/31. So they were not terminated because they were not employed, but their benefits ended. Similarly, for Lois Lane, if her COBRA benefits had ended, we would have entered that here. The one other thing that's very important for the self-funded plans is the dependent information. Now, the dependent information is necessary because, again, you are the insurance company, so you don't just have to report for your employees who are covered, but also anybody else who's covered under the plan, which is going to be any spouses or dependents. So similarly to the other tabs, you'll see our notes column here. If there's something you feel important to let us know, you can put it here. You'll put the employee's social as well as the dependent social. Now, the IRS does allow to use a dependent's date of birth, especially in instances where it's a newborn and their SSN Social Security number has not yet been assigned. So, go ahead and do that. You're supposed to have the first names here. I apologize for not having those populated, but you would indicate the individuals here, the employee social, the dependent social, or date of birth, their last name, first name, and middle initial, and then which months they were covered. Now, it's important to note that the individuals can only be covered for the months that the individual was covered here. So if we look at Archie Andrews, we'll see that he was covered. He began the year covered, but he terminated May 31st. And if we look here, we'll see that that's when his coverage is. After May, there's no more coverage. Now, Logan Howlett was covered all year. However, baby Howlett was born just on July 1st, so you'll see that's why coverage starts in July. And lastly, Peter Parker has his dependent here and was only covered those first 4 months because I believe that's when Peter Parker was covered as well. Oh, so he switched to waived. So at the end of April, he was waived coverage. So the other individuals were no longer covered as well. So that concludes the employee and employer data gathering spreadsheets. These should cover almost all of the situations you need to get us the data so we can complete your ACA reporting. If there are any other situations or questions you have, please feel free to give us a call. You can reach us at 954-983-9970, and the ACA department is extension 4. Thank you and have a great day.